Well, hello, everyone. This is Lisa Graves from Court Accountability Action with the Midas Touch Network here on Legal AF. And today I am so excited to talk with Carrie Baker, who has written a really important book about the abortion pill and is an expert in that issue and also on the attacks that we're seeing on access to that vital medicine. Carrie is a professor of women's studies at Smith College, and she's also a regular contributor to Ms. Magazine. I am just so honored to have you on, Carrie, and excited to hear about what you're going to say, although I'm a little worried given the state of affairs that we're seeing, both in terms of the Trump administration and in terms of the state court. But welcome to the show, Carrie, and glad to have you on.
Great to be here, Lisa.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about right now in terms of the risks of people losing access to this vital medicine, which I understand to be the most common form of abortion post-Dobbs, to have a medication abortion, and what we're seeing happening. I'm certainly seeing some maneuvers from groups tied to Leonard Leo, like the Students for Life group and others. We've obviously been seeing this study that is not really much of a study, but is a propaganda document that's been produced by the Ethics and Public Policy Center. They call themselves the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I've known about EPPC for more than 25 years, based on numerous things they've done and said that I've found to be really destructive of progress. But that's my perspective. So could you share your perspective with us?
Yeah, well, I want to start by, you said that the majority of abortions are done with medications. That's true. Over 63%. Actually, it was 63% in 2023, and it's gone up since then. So it is an absolutely critical way that people are accessing abortion, especially people living in states with bans and restrictions, because 8 states have passed telehealth shield laws that enable providers in those states to prescribe these medications to people in Texas and Louisiana. And of course, that makes them very mad. And so as a result, they're really focusing on abortion pills. But at the outset, I just want to say there's no way they're going to stop abortion pills. Around the country, in nations where abortion is entirely banned, abortion rates are as high or higher than in nations where it's legal. And, in the old days, it used to be done procedurally and it was dangerous. But now that we have abortion pills, which are safer than Tylenol, people are able to access these medications, through underground networks and use them safely. And so I guess, yes, it's very disturbing what they're doing. They're putting all kinds of barriers in the way to people accessing abortion. But I will say, I think there have been unintended consequences. For example, abortion has gone through the roof since Dobbs. In 2020, there were 930,000 abortions. In 2023, there were 1,033,000 abortions. It went up 10%, in part because of, Dobbs shook everything up, and it forced people on the abortion rights side to get creative and find new ways to put pills in people's hands. And they have done that extremely effectively. And so I can talk in more detail about the skirmishes that are going on. But I guess overall, I'd like to say they're not going to stop these medications from getting to people who really want them.
Well, that's right. I think one of the things that we've heard over time in the battle to have access to abortion, from decades ago and of course in recent years, is that abortions will continue to happen. Women need abortions. They have a right to control their destiny, in my view, and want access to that medicine. And the only thing that has changed has been the legality or constitutional protection for abortion that was secured by Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which was the decision that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor helped write back, 30 years ago. But, one of the things that I just wanted to say, it's really surreal to me to be seeing these circumstances unfold with these states, some states like Texas trying to bar women from even leaving the state to access abortion. Back in 1991, I wrote a paper about the Irish abortion case, which I'm sure you know of, Carrie, but a lot of people probably didn't know at the time. It's sort of pre-Google, but it was about whether a young girl from Ireland who had been involuntarily impregnated, who wanted to seek an abortion in England where abortion was legal, whether she could leave the country to do so. And looking at that case and looking at the anti-abortion movement in the United States at that time, I posited that that was where the United States was heading. If these anti-abortion operatives got their way, that we would be in a position where the right to travel, which is one of the rights that the Constitution guarantees, would not be used, would basically be rejected or ignored by states trying to impose their laws in other states. It'd be like if someone, a state had a bar on gambling and then was prosecuting people for going to Las Vegas to gamble. Where it's legal there. Or, prosecuting someone for going to another state to smoke pot in a state where it's legal. In this instance, we see these really repressive politicians in Texas in particular, but other states as well, who are trying to limit people's ability to travel to access abortion. That's surgical abortion, for example, if they need that type of treatment. But now we've also seen Texas and other states trying to assail providers for people who are prescribing that medicine for women in those states, and who should be able to access that safe medicine that's been proven safe for so long. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And then I want to ask you another question about the history of this battle.
Sure, absolutely. So yes, you reference Ken Paxton, who's the Attorney General of Texas, filed a civil suit against a New York doctor who sent abortion pills to a Texas woman. And he got his judgment in the Texas court, and he marched up to New York to try to get it enforced. And the governor of New York and the AG, Letitia James, said, no, your judgment is no good in our state because they had a provider shield law. Similarly, Louisiana has indicted, ironically, the same doctor. And again, the governor refused to extradite the doctor. And since then, the state of New York has passed a law that removes the requirement that the doctor put their name on the prescription medication. They only have to put their business name. And that is an attempt to try to protect the brave doctors who are these provider shield telehealth doctors that are sending pills to people in banned states. So, we are definitely having interjurisdictional abortion wars where Texas is trying to extend their law outside of their state borders and impose it on people in New York. And, their laws prohibit doctors within their borders from doing abortions. They don't prohibit their citizens from ordering abortion medications. Matter of fact, they explicitly exempt people from taking the medications from any sort of criminal penalty. And there was legislation before the current session to try to add that penalty. And the, lefty liberal Texas legislature, I'm being facetious, didn't do it. And so I think that it's interesting. I really think it's a small group of very extreme people that want to try to prevent women from crossing borders or getting these medications. The fact of the matter is, in Texas and Louisiana, the majority of people support abortion rights, like 60%. Of Republicans. This is a bipartisan issue. But because our legislative bodies have been so gerrymandered and, there's been voter suppression, we have these very extreme legislatures that pass these extreme measures that the people don't agree with. And so I think that it's a political crisis at one level, but people don't want what they're doing.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I have a new book coming out called Without Precedent, and a new site for that, withoutprecedent.info. And in that book, I talk about how abortion is more popular than the current president, the previous president. It is more popular, I think, than almost any president since Eisenhower, basically. And people want access to medicine. They do not want these small-minded political opportunists to be using the legislature to impose their own views on other people's lives that they are not involved in, that they don't have any right to make these decisions in. And in fact, some of the decisions, in the array of reasons why women may seek abortion are heart-wrenching. A cancer diagnosis, other circumstances where they, may have been seeking a child, but the pregnancy is inviable, or there's a fatal defect, birth defect that would affect the life of the child in a way that they would not survive. There are all these just extraordinary circumstances that families are contending with, and most women who have abortions are women who already have children. And so, this is not about, this is not reckless people or something. It's absurd, the sort of rhetoric of these right wingers around this issue. But one of the things that I had sort of forgotten, but I think your book really tells so compelling, your book, Abortion Pills, really tells so compelling is the history of access to safe abortion medication with RU486. And in your book, you talk a bit about this as a form of McCarthyism. And I had sort of forgotten that it was that the primary medicine was created in 1980. This is a medicine that's been around for 45 years. It took a long time to get approved in the United States. Ultimately, it was approved in the United States. And that's because there are hundreds of studies that have shown how safe and effective it is. But that history, the time frame of this pill's availability abroad, and you talk about in your book things that I had not realized, didn't see in the other things I was working on, but how early on in the United States there were women who were immigrants who received the pill from their relatives in other countries. And then were prosecuted by some of these states for accessing abortion in that way, that it was criminalized. It's just really horrifying to see that history and then to see an effort to sort of repeat that history. So I wonder, Carrie, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I will say, so medication abortion is two medications: mifepristone, which is the one that was developed in 1980 in France, and then approved in France in 1980, but wasn't approved in the US till 2000. And it's used in combination with misoprostol, which is a common ulcer medication and widely available. And because so many immigrants in the United States don't have access to health care, often they get it through their communities. They get it at flea markets or bodegas or through relatives and in the community. And around the world, in countries that ban abortion, women actually use misoprostol alone without mifepristone for abortion. It's quite effective and very safe. And, it's a little bit of a harder process, but that is what people use around the world because misoprostol is so accessible. And so here in the United States, going back to the early 90s, women in immigrant communities were using misoprostol. They were bringing practices that they had from primarily South American countries to the United States when they immigrated here. And so the first underground abortion pill networks were actually in those immigrant communities. And I say first because now those networks are robust. They go beyond immigrant communities. There are tens of thousands of pills that are sent for free by advocates because they're committed to getting pills in hands for people in banned and restricted states. There's a group called redstateaccess.org. If you go to their website, you'll see who to email in every state that bans or restricts abortion, who to email to get the pills sent to you for free. And that network is probably sent 150,000 pills since Dobbs, and it's growing, it's strengthening. There, a lot of them are angry older women that remember pre-Roe and are like, never again. And they're breaking the law, but they're not going to stop. And, they're smart. They've got, and they're not the only network. That's one of the networks. But, again, they're not going to stop people from getting these medications if people are really determined. And by the way, the pills that Red State Access sends it's the combination of Miffy and Miso. So, But I just to back up, I decided to write this book when right after Dobbs, a group of anti-abortion doctors in Texas filed a lawsuit claiming that one, abortion pills were dangerous, and two, that the approval through the FDA had been rushed. Well, I had been following abortion pills for quite a while with Ms. and writing articles. I knew they were very safe. But I knew less about the history. So that I went and looked and tried to find the history and there wasn't one. So I decided to write it. And that's what my book, Abortion Pills, is. And what I discovered is that it was a long drawn out fight to get the pill approved by the FDA. And there was tons of scientific evidence to show that it was safe. And today, 7.5 million people have used the abortion pill just in the United States since it was approved in 2000. And it is, as I said before, safer than Tylenol, widely used. The anti-abortion movement is putting out flawed, sort of fake studies trying to claim that they're dangerous, to influence the Trump administration to retract approval of the abortion pill. But, it's all lies. I mean, these medications are very safe for women that use them. And so, again, my book goes into the whole history of the fight to get them approved. And then even once they were approved, they were highly restricted. And it's been a gradual process over decades. And it was during the pandemic that telehealth abortion first developed. And that was because we all started using telemedicine and we couldn't go in person to doctors' offices. And so, a group sued the FDA because before that you could only get these medications by going in person to a doctor. But the FDA lost this lawsuit and had to allow telehealth abortion, which means you consult with a doctor, through a video conference or online forms, and then they mail you the pills. And that is what has been a lifesaver post Roe versus Wade being overturned.
Yeah, it's really interesting because over the last, like you point out, since the pandemic, with the relaxation of telehealth, we've seen actually a burgeoning business across the board with like Hims and Hers. They do a lot of advertising, right? And they're about being able to access medication without having to wait in line at your local doctor or to get a doctor or referral from this insurance company that, to this person, to that person. But you can just, have access to telehealth. And it's just been revolutionary in all sorts of areas, including in the area of access to abortion. But a couple things I wanted to flag. One is, as you talked about that, that's the history of abortion. I think both of us are just from the generation removed from the generation of women who lost friends and sisters and mothers and aunts and classmates to abortions that were botched, that were conducted by people who were not qualified to give abortions, that were very dangerous in terms of the sanitary experiences when abortion was illegal in the backroom abortions. And so many people in the generation ahead of us, had their friends bleed to death because of surgical abortions in an environment in which abortion was illegal in many states. And there's no way we should allow America to return to those dark days. And yet you have these ridiculous lawsuits, a concocted lawsuit that propelled your book, that inspired your book, that was launched in a teeny town, relatively speaking, in Texas, in Amarillo, Texas, so that it could be seen by the one judge in Texas, Matthew Kacsmaryk, who was handpicked for that court, who was a longtime anti-abortion, anti-gay activist. He even hid from the American people an article that he'd written attacking abortion rights just before he was confirmed. So they know who he is. They know he's been an operative for them, and they shot this case so he would be 100% chance the judge who got it. And as you point out, the group that sort of, or the groups that launched this lawsuit, this Hippocratic Oath entity, and we've got some more on that on our website. But basically, this group was concocted. One of the main leaders of it isn't even in Texas; she's in Michigan. Another person, as you point out, was a dentist. And their
Yes.
claim, the claim of this, little group of manufactured plaintiffs was that they had standing to sue to attack the FDA's long ago approval, more than 20 years ago, approval of access to this abortion medication, that they had standing to sue because they might someday possibly have to perform an abortion if the pills were not successful in completing that abortion. So this completely remote, absurd claim. And then the appellate court, which again was staffed in part by another Trump judge, James Ho,
Yes.
who I used to work with alongside at the Judiciary Committee, and who is just so extreme. James Ho had the
Yes.
audacity to assert that a doctor should have standing to sue to ensure that the pregnancy goes forward, that they have an interest basically that exceeds the privacy interests and health interests of women and their families, in essence. And then this Supreme Court, this Roberts Court, took the case knowing that there was no standing, and then kicked it back
Yes.
down, knowing that the case would go forward again with Matthew Kacsmaryk because he had allowed states to intervene, in essence. And also, in my opinion, knowing that they were paving the way for Trump's return through that terrible immunity decision, which I'm not gonna squeeze you to answer that part of it on. But this court has been engaged in all sorts of machinations, not just there, but also in Idaho, where there was a case that Idaho was trying to stop women from accessing abortion at emergency rooms if their health was endangered, even if they weren't on the brink of death, under EMTALA, a Reagan-era law that prevented hospitals from dumping patients out of emergency rooms. The Supreme Court intervened and took that case before the appellate court could even resolve it. And then it appears decided that they didn't want to issue a ruling blocking women from health-saving access to abortion in an election year, and kicked that case back again, where now the Trump administration has dismissed, basically sought to get rid of these cases because it's going to do its own activities to restrict access, including restricting access under EMTALA for women whose health is endangered. And we've seen women die in Georgia and other places where they were bleeding, and they were denied access to an abortion because of the state's restrictions and the interpretation of those hospitals that they would be breaking the law if they helped those women die because they could not get treatment. So we're in I think a really precarious position from the standpoint of this minority of very aggressive politicians that are willing to risk women's lives, willing to have people lose their parents and their spouses in order to advance what I consider to be their own religious views as law. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that.
Well, we saw this in Project 2025. It very explicitly targeted abortion and abortion pills in particular. And it used evangelical language. I mean, it is a Christian nationalist document. That agenda is about instituting Christian nationalism into the federal government and, sort of prioritizing one particular religious viewpoint. And it is truly terrifying that we are here. So, just sort of go back, you had talked about, before Roe and us not remembering, and I am of your generation. I didn't know people who died before Roe. I was very young when Roe came down. But when Roe was overturned, I was less worried about people accessing abortion safely because I knew about abortion pills. I was very worried about people who experienced complications in a wanted pregnancy, not being able to get the medical care that they needed. And that is, in fact, what we have seen. Women around the country are dying. They're ending up losing fallopian tubes or uteruses and never being able to have the children they want. It's a brutal policy. And if you look at, you mentioned Idaho, if you look at the way that Idaho tried to defend their law, which had no exception for dire emergencies that endanger women's health, and, knowing that women were airlifting out of the state to get emergency medical care, and they didn't care. I mean, it's truly horrifying what's going on in the United States today. And so, we need to fight back on this. We need legal abortion. I mean, we need legal reproductive health care. What's happened in Idaho is that OBGYNs have left the state. There is a maternal health crisis going on, because I've been working with some folks in Idaho, and a woman said she needed an appointment with an OBGYN just to have some hormone medications. And it was a 4-month wait, and she had to drive 2 hours to get to the doctor. There just aren't OBGYNs. And so, this is going to spread across the country as these laws, unless we can turn this around, and it will endanger women's health. Many of the states with the most extreme laws have disbanded their maternal mortality commissions because they don't want to know that women are dying, or they want to be able to cover it up. And the same with infant mortality is going way up. Like in Texas, it went way up. These folks are going after not only abortion, but also contraception. And, the elimination of Planned Parenthood, the funding through the budget bill, will eliminate 200 out of 600 Planned Parenthood offices. Well, many, many women across the country get their basic health care at Planned Parenthood. They get, contraception. If you don't have access to contraception, there's going to be more unwanted pregnancies, and there's going to be more abortions. And I actually think that's one reason why the number of abortions has gone up so much since Dobbs, is because the states banning abortion are also restricting contraception. So there's higher rates of unwanted pregnancies. And so more abortion, and by the way, those numbers I gave you at the beginning of the show were just for abortion through the medical system. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are getting abortion medications outside of the medical system. And if your listeners want to know what are the options in your state, go to the website plancpills.org, put on by the organization called Plan C. And they have a drop-down menu. You can search state by state, and it will tell you exactly what are the telehealth providers serving your state. If you're in a ban or restricted state, what are the community networks serving your state? And folks can also order abortion pills through e-commerce sites, through websites selling these pills. And Plan C has vetted websites that are selling safe pills and are reliable websites. And so that is an option for people if they need this care.
Carrie, thank you so much for all that information. I was shocked as we were tracking what was happening in Idaho that, as you point out, that legislature stopped tracking the mortality, maternal mortality. It's just abominable. They so don't immoral. Care. Yeah, that was shocking. Yeah. And then there was a tremendous PBS series about interviewing OBGYNs who were leaving the state because they felt like they could not provide services to women facing high-risk pregnancies. And to say that you're pro-family and then to adopt policies like that, it's really outrageous. And one of the key figures in that Idaho effort is Erin Hawley, who is the spouse of Josh Hawley. She was the lawyer that they outsourced the litigation to. She's a former clerk for Justice Roberts, along with her husband, Josh Hawley. And they've been at the forefront of this effort to deny access to abortion and to make all sorts of claims about abortion that I think have been really debunked. But I also really appreciate that you mentioned that the House bill on the budget, takes aim at Planned Parenthood, would force the shutdown of so many states where Planned Parenthood is, none of those federal dollars are spent on abortions. There's already been a longstanding law, as many of our listeners and watchers know. The Hyde Amendment has barred the ability to use federal funds directly for abortions. And so the money that is going into these Planned Parenthood clinics is for Medicaid recipients to have access to contraception, to have access to pap smears and cancer screenings and the like. And so it is just a devastating effort to punish Planned Parenthood for providing basic medical services that women in our communities need, in many communities where they can't get access or ready access to those services. And so it is just a frontal assault. And as you point out, it's also tied intimately to that Project 2025 agenda that Trump denied was his, even though he was on tape saying they're going to do the details. And we've already seen some of those parts of Project 2025 being implemented in this arena and other arenas. And when you point out like the imposition of one particular religious focus on what I call the cry-nats, to try to impose their agenda on the rest of us. When I was doing a podcast last year for Grave Injustice with Courier, I interviewed people who studied the evangelical movement, which came out in favor of Roe, back, in the 1970s. It's only been in
Southern
recent
Baptist
years.
Convention celebrated Roe when it came out.
Yes.
They didn't think the government
Yeah.
should be involved. It's ironic.
And so, but here we are now with this real effort by some people who are devoted to theocracy to trying to restrict the rights of people in the United States in this way and other ways. And so I'm just so honored to have you on, Carrie. I appreciate your work. I think it's in the vein of the Janes, really to make sure to help people understand these rights and the valiant, courageous efforts of many people across the country to ensure that their fellow Americans have access to this safe medicine in order to protect their health and to determine their destinies. So, Carrie, I hope you'll come back on.
I just want to say that the book is available open access at Amherst College Press. And this is a moving target. I'm continuing to report on what's happening on a regular basis. Things are happening. The Trump administration is trying to roll back FDA approval of mifepristone. So folks can keep up on the latest by following me at Ms. Magazine.
Thank you so much, Carrie. We'd love to have you back anytime. And to our listeners, please subscribe, please share, and please come back. Thank you so much.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.